Hey everyone, thank you for all the support, and tonight's video is packed with some truly chilling stories that only get creepier. Sit back, relax, and let's get into it. I was spending a semester in Alaska as part of a graduate research program connected to environmental science. My university had partnered with a few organizations that were collecting long-term data related to changing ecosystems, permafrost conditions, and seasonal environmental patterns. Most of my coursework was through the university, but part of the program involved spending time in remote communities and gathering field observations that would later be incorporated into larger research projects. The arrangement sounded exciting when I first applied. I had grown up in the lower 48 states and had never lived anywhere remotely comparable to rural Alaska. I had visited snowy places before, but that was completely different from actually living there. What surprised me most wasn't even the cold. It was the isolation. There were entire stretches of time when the world felt quiet. Quiet in a way I wasn't used to. The house I was staying in belonged to a family that spent part of the year elsewhere. Through a connection with the program, I was allowed to rent it while conducting research nearby. It wasn't a cabin in the middle of nowhere like people imagine when they think of Alaska. There were other homes scattered throughout the area, but they weren't close together. Trees separated a lot of the properties, and heavy snowfall made everything feel even more isolated. The house itself was fairly normal. One thing I remember was how many windows it had. At night, I hated it because every window became a black mirror. I had been there for about 2 weeks when the first thing happened. That evening, I spent the day reviewing field notes and entering data into spreadsheets. Around 8 or 9, I made dinner, called my mom. By 10:30, I was getting ready for bed. Headlights flashed across the snow outside, and the lights stopped moving. I walked toward the living room window and carefully looked through. There was a dark van sitting in my driveway. When I say dark, I mean black. Black body, dark windows, no visible markings. It just stood out because I wasn't expecting anyone. I checked my phone, thinking someone from the research group had sent a message and forgotten to mention they were stopping by. There was nothing. The van wasn't parked directly in front of the house. It had stopped closer to the road where the driveway widened. I was standing there trying to decide whether I should wave or turn on the porch light or something. Eventually, I decided that would be weird because I had no idea who it was. The van remained there. A minute passed. The engine appeared to be running because I could occasionally see exhaust drifting through the headlights. I couldn't see anybody inside. The windows were too dark. If someone needed directions or assistance, why weren't they getting out? After a few more minutes, the van simply backed up, turned around, and drove away. That was it. No one exited the vehicle. I locked the front door and checked the back door before going to bed. The next morning, I had mostly forgotten about it. The weather was decent for that time of year, so I decided to walk around the property before heading out for work. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in a clean white layer. I was walking behind the house when I saw something strange near the edge of the snow. There were several small brownish clumps partially frozen into the snow. I crouched down to look at them and realized they weren't animal droppings. They looked more like someone had chewed something and spit it out. There were multiple pieces. A couple had strange grayish material mixed in. Somebody had discarded chewing tobacco. I wasn't familiar with tobacco products, so I didn't think much beyond that. What bothered me was the location. The pieces weren't near the driveway. They were behind the house. I walked farther along the back side of the property and found more. Then I found some near the rear steps, another piece near the back door. The snowfall had been fresh. Those pieces hadn't been sitting there for weeks. I ended up taking a couple photos with my phone because they seemed strange. Later that day, I showed them to someone from the local community who occasionally assisted with our research activities. The moment he saw the photos, he said it looked like ecumic. I had never heard that word before. He explained that cumic is a traditional form of smokeless tobacco. He pointed out the grayish material mixed in with the tobacco. Apparently ash is often part of the mixture. I remember asking whether someone chewing it would spit it out like that. He laughed and said yes, and asked where I found it. He said somebody had probably walked through the property. It was private property, but I tried not to overthink it. That night, I closed all the curtains. Over the next few days, classes continued. I drove to field sites, entered data, attended virtual meetings, and gradually stopped thinking about the van and the tobacco. There was never enough evidence to justify being worried. One thing that took me a while to get used to was how sounds behaved around the house. Snow made everything strange. Some noises were completely muffled. Chunks of snow sliding off the roof could sound surprisingly loud. Wind moving through trees created noises that seemed closer than they actually were. Ice shifting sometimes produced sounds that resembled distant footsteps. By the third week, I was getting better at identifying what was normal, or at least I thought I was. About 4 days after finding the tobacco, I stayed up. I had finished my work and was lying in bed scrolling through articles on my phone while thinking about a presentation I needed to give when I returned to campus. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't even close to asleep. Around midnight, I heard a heavy rush of snow slide down from somewhere above. The sound happened outside the wall I was leaning against. It startled me, but only because it was loud. Then I ignored it. Snow regularly slid from the roof. It happened often enough that I barely paid attention anymore. I kept reading. A few minutes later, I got up to get water from the kitchen. If I had gone to sleep right then, I never would have seen what came next. I filled a glass at the sink and wandered into the living room. Sometimes when I couldn't sleep, I would walk around the house for a few minutes. It sounds odd, but the movement helped clear my head. The living room had a high ceiling, and one section of the roof extended above it at an angle. Near that upper section was a small window installed almost like a skylight, except it was vertical rather than horizontal. At night, it was usually just a black rectangle. I happened to glance up toward it while taking a sip of water. Something wrong. I was looking at a person. Someone was outside the house looking in through that upper window. The location made no sense. The window was high off the ground. Not impossibly high, but high enough that a person couldn't simply walk up and look through it. The roof beneath it was steep and covered in snow. Getting into that position would have required effort. The figure appeared completely dark. Black jacket, dark face covering. They were just staring in. I dropped the glass. Water went everywhere and the glass shattered. I ran straight down the hallway toward my bedroom. That wasn't the smartest thing to do. I should have grabbed my phone immediately, or maybe gone through the front door and driven away. Instead, I reacted completely on instinct. I got into the bedroom, locked the door, and grabbed my phone from the bed. I called the police and told them someone was outside my house. While I was on the phone, I turned off the bedroom light. Officers arrived. I explained everything. Nobody was found. There wasn't an obvious explanation. If somebody had been standing near a ground floor window, that would have been scary but understandable. People can walk up to windows. What I couldn't stop thinking about was where I'd seen them. I could tell somebody had definitely been near the house. I could also tell they hadn't simply stood on the ground and looked through that upper window. There were signs that someone had been on part of the roof. Again, I don't know how. No vehicles appeared. Research continued. People discussed environmental data and field observations while I sat there wondering who had been standing outside my house in the middle of the night. Eventually, the semester ended. I returned home. There were a few details that continued bothering me. One was the van. Years have passed. I don't think it was supernatural. I've never believed that. Somebody was physically there. The tracks proved that much. The question has always been who they were and why they were watching the house. I think there was simply a person out there whose intentions I'll never know. What makes the memory so unsettling isn't the idea that it was paranormal or mysterious. It's the fact that another human being spent time around that house, watching it, close enough to leave evidence behind, and I never learned who they were. And somewhere in Alaska, unless they've long since moved away or passed on, that person knows exactly why they were standing on a snowy roof in the middle of the night, staring into a stranger's house. I'm the only one who never got an answer. I ended up going to a concert almost by accident. My friend Kat had bought 2 tickets months earlier, and the person she was originally supposed to go with backed out a week before the show. She called me and asked if I wanted to go. I hadn't really taken a trip anywhere in a while. I said yes. The concert was held in a rural area a few hours away from where we lived. The venue itself was nice, but there wasn't much around it besides forests and scattered rental properties that mostly catered to tourists during the warmer months. We drove down early and spent most of the day wandering around before the gates opened. The show itself was great. We were standing for most of it, and by the time everything ended, my feet hurt and my voice was gone from yelling and singing along. Neither of us wanted to immediately make the drive home in the dark, especially because we both had work on Monday and knew we'd be exhausted. Kat had rented a place a few weeks earlier just in case. The listing described it as a cabin, but it wasn't really a cabin. It was a small house sitting alone in a wooded area. The GPS had us turning onto smaller and smaller roads. At one point, we were on a gravel road with trees on both sides and no streetlights. "This better not be how every horror movie starts," I said. Neither of us were nervous at the time. We were tired and still talking about the concert. The house eventually came into view through the trees. It sat by itself with a dirt driveway. There were no neighboring houses visible from the front. Maybe there were some farther away through the woods, but if there were, we couldn't see them. The check-in process was simple. The owner had messaged instructions earlier that day. Inside, there was a living room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. The furniture looked like it had been there for years. While unloading our bags, I noticed a laminated information sheet sitting on the kitchen counter. Stuff about trash pickup, Wi-Fi passwords, emergency contacts, and checkout instructions. One section mentioned local attractions and hiking trails, and mentioned local folklore and weird sightings that the area was supposedly known for. It mentioned reports from people who claimed they had seen strange figures in the woods over the years. It was presented like a tourist curiosity. Kat rolled her eyes when she read it. They're literally marketing cryptids now. Whatever gets bookings. That was pretty much the extent of our discussion about it. We unpacked a few things, charged our phones, and spent a while sitting around talking about the concert. By then it was fully dark outside. The woods around the house created a strange feeling at night. At some point, I went into my bedroom to change clothes and get comfortable. The room faced the back of the property. There was a single window with blinds overlooking the tree line. Something caught my attention outside. Near the trees, I saw a small red light. It was pretty dim. It wasn't moving like a vehicle. It was stationary and disappeared. I kept looking at the same spot. A few seconds later, the light appeared again. It wasn't blinking in a steady pattern like a tower light or anything electronic. It would simply appear for a second or two and then vanish. I was wondering if somebody nearby was smoking, and I was seeing the glow from a cig. The light appeared like 3 more times. Then I stopped watching. I closed the blinds and went back into the living room. Kat was scrolling through photos she'd taken at the concert. "You won't believe how many terrible pictures I took," she said. I sat down beside her and started looking through them. The red light completely left my mind, and close to midnight when things started getting strange. We were sitting on the couch looking through photos on her phone, and we heard a massive impact from above us. Both of us jumped. Something heavy had landed on the roof. Something heavy. The entire house seemed to react to it. Kat looked at me. "What was that?" I was listening. My assumption was that a tree branch had fallen onto the roof. There were plenty of trees around the property. Kat pointed out something. There wasn't any wind. The trees outside had been still all evening. I said, maybe something was already broken and finally came down. I don't know. The sound had been unusually heavy. A few minutes later, we heard another noise. Very brief. It came from above us. The roof wasn't steep enough for something to slide around naturally, and whatever we were hearing didn't sound like branches. Seconds later, we heard another noise. Again, it sounded like movement above us. Could somebody be up there? Who would be on the roof of a random rental house in the middle of the woods after midnight? But once the idea entered my head, I couldn't completely dismiss it. We walked around the house checking doors and windows. Instead of staying in separate bedrooms, we agreed we'd hang out in one room for a while. We ended up going into my bedroom because it had the larger bed. I locked the bedroom door, mostly as a joke at first. Kat laughed when I did it. Looking back, I think both of us were relieved once it was locked. We sat on the bed with our phones and kept talking. The house remained completely quiet until we heard a phone ringing. A ringtone, the old-fashioned kind. Neither of us questioned what we were hearing. It sounded like it was somewhere inside the house. It rang several times. The sound seemed to be coming from farther down the hallway. The rental house didn't even have a landline phone as far as we'd seen. The ringing stopped and we heard footsteps next, somebody walking. The sound moved past our bedroom door, slowly. The floor creaked in a way that made it very clear the movement was inside the house rather than outside. The footsteps continued for a few seconds. The thing that bothered me was the relationship between the footsteps and the ringing phone. The ringing had sounded farther away. The footsteps sounded much closer. Somebody had walked directly past the bedroom, which immediately created a problem neither of us wanted to say out loud. If we were hearing both sounds correctly, it suggested more than one person might have been in the house. I could hear Kat breathing beside me. I mean that kind of breathing where somebody is trying very hard to stay quiet but can't quite control it because they're scared. Both of us had heard the same things. Every time I looked at Kat, she looked just as confused and unsettled as I felt. After a couple of minutes, she whispered, "Did somebody just walk by?" "I think so." Neither of us really knew what to do after that. We weren't eager to open the door and start investigating. We just listened. I checked my phone several times. The signal wasn't great, but it existed. I remember opening the rental listing again and looking through the photos almost as if I expected to discover some hidden explanation. Maybe there was another unit attached to the property or some feature we had overlooked. There wasn't. It was just the house. Kat quietly asked if I thought somebody could have gotten inside before we arrived. The idea wasn't impossible. The house was isolated and probably sat empty a lot of the time, but it seemed unlikely. If somebody had been hiding there, where were they? The place wasn't very large. The next couple of hours were the longest part of the entire experience. Nobody tried opening the bedroom door. Eventually, I checked the time and realized it had been close to 2 hours since we'd heard the footsteps. That was when we started discussing leaving. The original plan had been to spend the night and drive home in the morning. The problem was that we also didn't want to walk out into a potentially occupied house. If somebody was actually inside, why had they stayed hidden for so long? None of it made sense. We agreed that sitting in a locked bedroom until sunrise wasn't helping anything. We were leaving. The decision itself was easy. Actually opening the door was the difficult part. I remember standing beside it with my hand on the lock for a few seconds. Kat had her keys ready. I unlocked the door, opened it. Nothing jumped out. Nothing moved. We turned on every light we could find and started gathering our things. We were moving through the entire house. Every doorway made me uneasy. The front door, Kat pointed it out. "Was that there earlier?" I looked where she was pointing. Near the lower section of the front door were several marks that looked like cuts or gouges. Knife marks was the first thing that came to mind. Not one or two. Several. They were noticeable once you looked closely. I couldn't remember seeing them when we arrived. I genuinely couldn't remember seeing them before. Around part of the exterior frame near the door, the wood looked darkened, blackened, like it had been exposed to heat at some point. As we moved through the front area of the house, I noticed an odor. Alcohol. A strong alcohol smell. The smell seemed to drift through part of the living room and hallway area. I tried figuring out where it was coming from, but couldn't. It wasn't attached to any specific object. It was just there. At that point, we stopped trying to explain things and focused on leaving. We grabbed everything we had brought into the house. The entire time I had the uncomfortable feeling that somebody was watching us from somewhere. We made few trips to the vehicle because neither of us wanted to leave our belongings behind. We got into the vehicle, locked the doors, and left. And we stopped trying to solve it. I think both of us realized we weren't going to figure it out. Kat reminded me about the local stories mentioned on that information sheet in the kitchen. The weird sightings people supposedly reported in the area. I told her I didn't think those stories had anything to do with what happened. Even now, I don't. The red lights are the only thing that remotely connect to any of that, and even those could have been dozens of normal things. The sounds inside the house. Years later, if you asked me what scared me most, it would be the combination of hearing a phone ringing somewhere farther down the house and then hearing somebody walk past our bedroom door. Somebody had access to the property. Both of us heard the same ringtone. Both of us heard the same footsteps. Both of us independently thought somebody was moving through the house. We ended up reporting the situation, but I never followed up. I mostly wanted to make sure somebody knew why 2 guests had suddenly checked out in the middle of the night. Nothing has ever felt quite like that house. Experiencing all of that during the same night while sitting in an isolated house surrounded by woods is what made it one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. It was one of those last-minute vacation ideas that came together because everyone's schedules happened to line up for once. There were 5 of us all together, all friends from college, who still managed to stay in touch despite living in different states. One of my friends found an old rental house online that looked interesting because it wasn't one of those modern vacation homes that all look the same. It was an older property that had been renovated enough to be comfortable, but still had a lot of original features. The house was surrounded by trees. There were neighboring properties farther down the road, but from the front porch, you couldn't really see any of them because of the tree line. The place itself looked like it had been standing there for over 100 years. And there were old photographs hanging throughout the house that seemed to have been left there intentionally as decoration. The photos made the place look like a museum. Most of them were black and white family pictures of people who had lived there decades ago. One picture showed a group of women standing in front of the house, wearing dresses that looked like they were from the early 1900s. There were 2 floors and more bedrooms than we actually needed. Since I arrived last, I ended up taking a room on the 2nd floor near the far side of the house. It wasn't a bad room at all. It had an old wooden bed frame, a dresser, a small writing desk, and 1 tall window overlooking the side yard. It was quieter than the other rooms. After midnight, everyone started drifting off to bed. The second day was the same. The only thing I can think of that stood out at all was a conversation we had during dinner. One of my friends mentioned that the house felt colder. That night I went upstairs earlier than everyone else because I was tired. I remember bringing a bottle of water with me and spending some time scrolling through videos on my phone before bed. The room felt normal when I first went in. I changed clothes, plugged my phone into a charger next to the bed, and got underneath the blankets. For a while I could hear faint voices downstairs where some of my friends were still talking in the living room. I wasn't asleep yet, but I was getting close to it. You're relaxed and your eyes keep drifting shut. The room suddenly felt much colder. This wasn't gradual. It felt like somebody had opened a door to winter. I could feel it against my face and hands. I got out of bed and checked it. The window was shut and locked. I pressed my hand around the frame because I expected to feel air coming through somewhere. I didn't. The glass felt cold, but there wasn't any noticeable draft. The room still felt freezing despite the window being closed. Same time, I heard something fall. It came from behind me near the dresser. A small decorative frame that had been sitting on top of the dresser was now lying on the floor. I walked over and picked it up. The frame wasn't damaged. I placed it back on the dresser and tested how stable it was because I wanted to understand how it had fallen. It seemed perfectly stable. Then another object fell. This time it was from the desk on the opposite side of the room. A small wooden ornament slid off the surface and hit the floor. There wasn't any obvious reason for it. The room was completely still. The curtains weren't moving. Nothing else appeared disturbed. At the same time, I heard what sounded like singing. I thought one of my friends was awake somewhere else in the house. Sounded like a woman quietly singing a melody. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The strange part was that it didn't sound like it was downstairs. It sounded closer. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. I figured someone downstairs had been humming, and the sound traveled through the house in a weird way. I went back into my room. The temperature still felt unusually cold. I sat on the edge of the bed for a minute, trying to decide whether I was overthinking everything. Then I heard the sound again. This time, there was no doubt. It was a woman's voice. I could hear the rise and fall of the melody. I listened carefully. The singing lasted 10 or 15 seconds before changing into something that immediately made every hair on my arms stand up. The voice started sounding really weird. The melody faded and was replaced by what sounded like somebody trying to suppress pain, like strained vocal sounds someone might make while injured. The closest comparison I can think of is hearing someone moan through clenched teeth after getting hurt. What made it disturbing was how human it sounded. I sat still, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound didn't seem to be coming from outside. It sounded like it was somewhere inside the house. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was after 2 in the morning. The voice continued for another few seconds before stopping abruptly. Even then, I wasn't thinking ghosts. One of my friends could have been awake. Somebody was watching videos on their phone. You know. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway again. The upstairs hallway ran the length of the house with several bedrooms connected to it. At night, it was darker than I expected because most of the light came from windows at either end. Only a small nightlight near the staircase provided any illumination. I started walking toward the room where 2 of my friends were staying. I was walking, and I just looked down the hallway toward one of the unused guest rooms. Someone was sitting on the floor. The shape was partially hidden by darkness and positioned near the wall outside the room. I stopped walking and assumed one of my friends was messing around. The figure didn't move. I remember feeling relieved for a second because seeing another person would have explained the sounds. My eyes adjusted a little more. What I was looking at didn't seem to be sitting. It appeared to be crouched. The shape was low to the ground with what looked like arms and legs supporting its weight. The closest description I can give is that it looked like somebody on all fours. No facial features. A dark shape against a darker section of the hallway. A luggage. One of my friends crouching down for some reason. It moved. It wasn't an object. I felt a surge of panic unlike anything I'd experienced before. I can still remember how that felt. There was something in the hallway with me, and I had no idea what it was. The shape seemed too low to be standing, too large to be an animal. It's just difficult to explain. I ran. I started screaming for my friends before I even reached their room. Within seconds, doors were opening all over the hallway, and people were asking what happened. I was trying to explain what I'd seen. A couple of them assumed there was an intruder. That was the thing that made the most sense at the time. Nobody was acting like this was some paranormal situation. Everyone was convinced there had to be a person somewhere in the house. They moved down the hallway toward the area where I'd seen the figure. The spot was empty. There was absolutely nothing there. They checked inside the unused guest room. Nothing found. Finding nothing would be reassuring, but I knew what I'd seen. Whether it had been a person, some weird trick of the lighting, or something else, I had definitely seen a shape there. Everyone eventually made their way downstairs to check the rest of the house. I followed because there was no chance I was staying upstairs alone. The entire first floor was searched room by room. The woods surrounding the house weren't dense enough for someone to disappear instantly, yet we didn't see anyone. Everyone ended up back inside. At that point, they believed that I had either mistaken a shadow for a person or seen one of my friends moving through the hallway. You know, problem with that theory was that every single person had been in their rooms when I started screaming. Nobody had been standing where I saw the figure. I wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. I knew I was tired, but I had been awake. I had gotten out of bed, checked the window, picked up the fallen objects, listened to the sounds, walked into the hallway, and seen something there. And the singing. I mentioned it several times. Nobody else had heard it. That didn't make sense. because the sound had seemed like it was inside the house and it had stopped the moment I stepped into the hallway. The conversation went in circles for a while, before everyone eventually agreed that nobody was sleeping alone for the rest of the night. We dragged blankets into the living room and stayed there until morning. I think we were all more unsettled by my reaction than by the actual story. I wasn't usually the type of person who panicked easily, and they knew that. The next morning, nothing stood out. The place where I'd seen the figure was just an ordinary section of wall and floor. I wasn't the only one who felt uncomfortable after that. One of my friends said that she hadn't slept well even before I started screaming because she kept hearing noises in the walls. None of that meant anything. People mishear things. The conversation kept coming back to the same question. Why had I reacted the way I did? What I saw may have had a perfectly normal explanation that I simply wasn't able to understand in the moment. I hope that's the case.